This is Sky News live from Hong Kong with a special programme as protests in this city move into a fifth month. Mass protesters defy the law and the police. We'll be hearing from some of them and from ordinary Hong Kong people worried their lives will be changed forever. We'll also hear from the families of police accused of brutal tactics and now also a target when they're off duty.
I don't have any 5 demands. I only have 1 demand, which is to keep my kids safe in a safe environment.
And the former Hong Kong Governor Lord Patten tells me the way the government here has dealt with the unrest is madness. That's all to come in the next half hour, live from Hong Kong. Good evening from Hong Kong, midnight here, where tonight we bring you a special programme on the growing and dangerous confrontation happening on the streets here every day. It is a confrontation between protesters and police first and foremost, but it is also a dramatic challenge to the authorities here and in Beijing. There have been more clashes today, with tens of thousands taking part in protests that began 4 months ago over an extradition bill now about human rights and democracy in the former colony handed back to China in 1997. In a moment, I'll be speaking to our special correspondent Alex Crawford on the streets of Hong Kong and our Asia correspondent Tom Cheshire, who is in Beijing. But first, our Southeast Asia correspondent Siobhan Robbins has the story of another violent day in this city.
After a brief respite, violence once again on the streets of Hong Kong. Tension has been building for a day as the now all too familiar cycle of tear gas and rubber bullets restarts. Protesters, refreshed from a break, are back on the streets in numbers. On Hong Kong Island, they target the police station, unloading their fury on the force that's become an enemy.
Police have been firing tear gas and rubber bullets because protesters have been trying to surround the police station here and have been throwing over missiles, rocks, anything they can find.
Clashes have been breaking out across the city, spiralling out of initially peaceful protests. Thousands have come out in the pouring rain, angry at a new ban on wearing masks at rallies. Another grievance to add to their growing list.
I don't like the Chinese government. It's cruel. I want the British government to come back and rule us again.
Carrie Lam says that rioters are responsible for, violence here. Who do you think's to blame?
We should blame Carrie Lam and the police force.
Why?
Because she do not respond for the 5 demands and make nowadays condition.
So when will you stop?
It's
You better go.
The arrival of riot police sends some scattering. Others reinforcing. Petrol bombs rain down. A journalist in their path is set alight. In Sam Shui Po, a gang of protesters brutally beat a taxi driver after he drives into the crowd. And in an unprecedented move, the Chinese People's Liberation Army warns demonstrators they're breaking the law and could suffer the consequences. This bitter fight has become very personal, targeting trains and banks, anyone seen as traitors to the cause. Vandalism and destruction are everywhere. After 4 months, positions in the battle are firmly entrenched, with neither side willing to give any ground.
Siobhan joins me now from the Causeway Bay area of Hong Kong. And Siobhan, another very tense and difficult day here.
That's exactly right, Mark. And this was the area that we watched police for hours pushing protesters back as they tried to regain this main shopping street block by block. And I was talking about the banks and stations that were targeted in the report. You can see a key example of it. This is a Chinese bank. The protesters have smashed in a plant pot there. There's water coming from the ceiling. It looks like there's damage inside, downstairs as well. The front window is totally gone. The display's been knocked over. You can see as we go round the corner, the front has been ripped off a plasma TV. The desks have been pushed over. There's loads of glass on the floor. Even the ATM has been totally smashed in. And this shows you the level of anger there is at anything that represents the state or someone that they believe has been treacherous, essentially, to their cause. Now, what's interesting, you can see that there's a fight for freedom message here and also protesters' posters. But they've also put one up saying, we apologise for the inconvenience that this has caused. But I think one of the most telling conversations that I had was outside this bank in the last half an hour. And a lady came up to me and she said, I know you think the protesters did this, but I believe it was someone to do with the government. Now, there is absolutely no evidence that that is the case, particularly as the protesters have put up this poster. But what's interesting is it shows you how much of a battle that the government has on their hands. That lady was a moderate person. She wasn't someone out on the front line. She wasn't someone who maybe even came out to protest. But it shows you that there are some people inside who still do not trust the government. And although there are others who are really grateful that they're bringing in emergency laws, that they finally want control back on the streets, there's another side who just do not trust them. And that is an important side that they need to bring back.
All right, Siobhan Robbins, thank you very much indeed. Now, the protests have been happening in this former British colony since June this year, and despite concessions from the Hong Kong government, the mainly young campaigners are now demanding full democracy, and that's where they're hitting a brick wall with Beijing. The protests were sparked by an extradition bill which would have allowed suspected criminals to be extradited to mainland China. Critics saw it as a means of undermining Hong Kong's rights and freedoms. The first large-scale protests began 2 months later when around 1 million people marched to the government's headquarters. They were largely peaceful, but 3 days later, police fired tear gas and rubber bullets on demonstrators in the most violent protest seen in decades. Shortly afterwards, Hong Kong's leader, Carrie Lam, said she would delay the extradition bill indefinitely. But protests continued, moving to the city's airport, forcing hundreds of flights to be cancelled. 5 months after announcing the extradition bill, Carrie Lam announced she would formally withdraw it. On the 70th anniversary of Chinese Communist Party rule, thousands of people defied a protest ban, with an activist shot by police with a live bullet for the first time. Just a few days later, the Hong Kong government banned masked protests, deploying emergency powers for the first time in more than 50 years. On the same day, a teenage boy was left in a serious condition after being shot in the leg. Well, the protests have pitched the police of Hong Kong against many of the people, particularly the younger generation. The police stand accused of brutality, but dozens of police officers have been injured themselves, some seriously. One plainclothes policeman was beaten and hit by a petrol bomb on Friday night. Our special correspondent, Alex Crawford, has been speaking to the police on the front line and their families, and a warning that her report contains some flash photography.
These are unprecedented scenes in Hong Kong. A police force under attack. And facing raw fury from its fellow citizens.
This is extraordinary, seeing the police being forced to retreat like this to the chants of gangster, gangster. There is such disgust and disdain for them. They're really unable to appear in any part of the city right now.
The multiple tear gassing and hundreds of rubber bullets fired. The use of water cannon and its blue dye. The aggressive storming of subway trains.
as well as apparently random and brutal arrests, have all led to huge anger against the police. For the first time, we hear from the police officers' families about how they're now pariahs in Hong Kong. They're so scared of revenge attacks, none of the 4 families we spoke to wanted to be identified.
We are very emotionally stressed and not feeling safe here in Hong Kong.
She told us threats had been made against her children. It's torn her extended family apart, with half of them not speaking to her.
I don't have any 5 demands. I only have 1 demand, which is to keep my kids safe in a safe environment. This is my only demand, which should be the right of every parent, but now it's not for us.
October the 1st was a turning point, the first police shooting of a protester. It sparked outrage. Protesters went on a revenge rampage. And police paid for it with their blood. These pictures we've obtained show an officer who's been sprayed with corrosive liquid. There have been several policemen attacked like this. The police wives believe it's their men who are paying for what are politicians' mistakes.
The Hong Kong government needs to do something. They need to start using politics to govern the city, rather than using the Hong Kong police as a political tool to help them.
Most police now wear masks themselves after their identities were spread online and their families hounded. Even when not working, they're not safe. Protesters say this off-duty policeman ran into one of them. His car was quickly surrounded. He got out of his vehicle, his right hand on his holster, and appeared to be trying to calm the crowd when he was grabbed around the neck from behind. He holds his hand up as if to fire in the air, but the crowd pulls him down. Seconds later, a shot is heard. And a 14-year-old boy is hit in the leg. From another angle, you see the crowd setting on him, beating him, before a firebomb is thrown. These acts terrify the police families.
I'm worried about his life, and I'm worrying that one day he won't come back home. I have 2 children, and they always ask, where is my daddy? Why can't I see him every day?
But the protesters are showing a real bitterness towards the police.
It looked like you were trying to hurt him, maybe even kill him.
Yeah, but he was trying to kill us too, by firing the pistol.
They attacked us first with guns.
Do you think it's justified, that sort of behaviour?
Yes.
Why?
Because they're trying to kill us with real bullets.
It seems like war.
I think it's war. They're using the emergency law.
This is the ugly reality for Hong Kong's police now. It's tearing communities and police families apart, making them think what had been unthinkable before, like divorce.
Have you actually thought of that?
Yes, and just solely because to protect my kids, not because of I don't love my husband. But I love my kids more.
Whilst the police are out on the streets, their spouses are telling their children to keep their jobs a family secret. But they're clearly filled with fear and frustration.
I'm born in Hong Kong. I lived in Hong Kong more than 30 years. We love Hong Kong so much. We care other ones so much. But now, I don't think so. I'm so disappointed about the Hong Kong situation.
But right now, sympathy is scarce for the police or their families, and the gulf between police and protesters is getting ever wider.
Alex has been out on the streets of Hong Kong tonight, on the streets of Kowloon, in fact, and she joins us now. Alex, what's been happening?
Well, there's been this great deal of unrest about a couple of kilometres, square kilometres around this area. We're actually in Mongkok at the moment, but we're in Kowloon Tong as well. And there was a lot of vandalism, a lot of setting on particularly MTR subway stations. They were smashing up the insides of subway stations, trying to do as much damage as they could, vandalising the area. This one, they built a fire outside. It's now out, but they also unleashed, if you look down there, they threw a whole load of rubbish. They chucked whatever they could down there, a few petrol bombs as well, and also set off the fire sprays, if you like, to flood it, and that has been going for many, many hours. They had barricades, which they then set fire to. The police came and cleared the area, and then immediately afterwards, they set up more barricades. There are still people sort of milling around, but most of the protesters, it has to be said, have gone away. And if we look down the side of this station, go and come over here. If we look down the side of this station, you can see they've defaced the whole of this wall. They put up pro-Beijing lawmakers and defaced their posters. They've defaced some Beijing politicians. And if you go along here, you can see the other entrance of the MTR station. The MTR station has taken a lot of the vandalism because they believe that they're complicit in the police actions, that they shut down the stations, that they don't hand over CCTV when the police stormed the area. An awful lot of damage. We saw them vandalising not just MTR stations, and there's several of them, but also Chinese businesses, Chinese outlets, a pro-Beijing district political office, and of course, just a few kilometres away from here, what many people in Hong Kong will feel is particularly significant. They went to the PLA barracks, the Chinese barracks, just a few kilometres away, and as they congregated around there, they saw a whole string of bodies on the top of the balcony, one of which held up what appeared to be a yellow-orange flag with Chinese and English writing on it, telling them that they were acting illegally and to leave the area. And then someone said in a loudspeaker that they had to be responsible for their consequences, the same sort of language which is used repeatedly in Chinese propaganda. Now, many local people felt that was very eerie, and they were most upset by that. As I said, the streets are now cleared more or less. The weather has helped to spread them and send them home, but there's still lots of barricades up here and an awful lot of clearing up for the people around here to do.
All right, Alex, thank you very much. Well, what began as opposition to a proposed extradition law has grown into really a serious challenge to the Chinese leader Xi Jinping. The protesters are angry about what they see as creeping interference by Beijing in Hong Kong's affairs, but China denies it is meddling and has accused foreign governments, including the United States and Britain, of stirring up anti-China sentiment. Asia correspondent Tom Cheshire joins me now from Beijing. Good evening, Tom. I mean, this is very difficult for Xi Jinping, isn't it? How long can he tolerate seeing these sorts of protests in Hong Kong?
I mean, they've tolerated for a long time already, Mark, as you say, coming into the 5th month of these protests. And I think they've always taken this wait-and-see approach, especially in the run-up to National Day, which is on Tuesday, when they had a huge military parade here in Beijing. I think there was a sense that nothing was going to really happen in terms of Beijing intervening very directly. As Alex Crawford was mentioning there, the People's Liberation Army garrison in Hong Kong, they've stayed there the whole time. They haven't been out on the streets because nothing wanted to spoil China's big day. One person who was here at the big day too was Carrie Lam, the chief executive of Hong Kong. She was very prominent and spotted here. And then as soon as she got back to Hong Kong, she enacted this emergency law banning face masks. A lot of people have accused her of being a puppet of Beijing. And it was quite striking that when she announced this new legislation, invoking this legislation banning face masks, she said there was absolutely no interaction, discussion, encounter whatsoever with any Central People's Government's officials on this matter during my very brief stay in Beijing. She wants to say that she's in charge. But on the other hand, Beijing likes what she's doing this weekend. On Friday evening, the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office That's the State Council office here that's responsible for looking after Hong Kong and Macau. They said the measures she was taking were absolutely necessary. And they also said now it's reached an important moment to take a clearer attitude and more effective measures to stop the violence and chaos. They also said the current chaos in Hong Kong cannot continue indefinitely. That indefinitely is ominous. And also in terms of how it's been treated by the Chinese leadership, they've been very, very quiet all through this summer of discontent. But over the last week, in run-up to the National Day, Xi Jinping himself mentioned Hong Kong. He said he wanted to ensure the prosperity and stability of Hong Kong. That might sound like an olive branch, but it could also be a threat if you're a protester, saying they'll take any measures necessary to do that. In terms of the thing we've all been, thinking about, worrying about whether the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, will be deployed on the streets of Hong Kong. They had movements in Shenzhen, the Chinese city just by Hong Kong, where they very ostentatiously did drills, saying, look, we have the power to do this. I don't think they're at that stage yet. It's been very clear they want this to be a Hong Kong problem. The whole idea that it's a challenge to the Communist Party leadership, which it certainly is, they don't want it to be framed that way. They see this as a Hong Kong problem, and they want Hong Kong to fix it while they can. So that's why they're supporting Carrie Lam taking these measures. They're hoping it will quell this unrest. The problem, I think, is if the measures she's taking now and measures she might take in the future actually add to that disturbance, that might force Beijing to intervene. And I don't think that's something it does want to do at this stage. As unpredictable as Hong Kong is, as embarrassing as it is on the international stage for it, if the PLA were to intervene, it's much more unpredictable after that, especially in terms of the international reaction from the US. And there's no sign of contagion, as it were, from the sort of unrest we're seeing in Hong Kong. Mainland opinion here seems to be pretty publicly, solidly against the Hong Kong protests. They don't feel they're threatened here on the mainland. But if things deteriorate in Hong Kong, at what point will the PLA intervene? At what point will Beijing decide we don't want to intervene, but it's going to happen? We're not there yet, but if things deteriorate, we could be heading further down that route.
OK, Tom, thank you very much. Well, Chris Patten was the last colonial governor of Hong Kong before the territory was handed over to China in 1997. Earlier, he told me of his frustration at the way events have unfolded, and especially at the way the Hong Kong government is handling things.
Nobody pretends that this is all independent action by Carrie Lam. She would have to be crazy to be making these decisions on her own without being pressured into them. The face marks business, absolutely madness, which people will protest against. Yeah. So the way forward is to engage with the demonstrators, particularly the peaceful demonstrators. The attitude of the Chinese government and the attitude of Carrie Lam is that they can simply rely on tear gas and plastic baton rounds and the courts to end what started as demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations, by 2 million people. They've actually got to engage with people. I don't condone violence of any sort whatsoever. I very much hope that those who've made petrol bombs, that those who've made steel rods to go out on these demonstrations will put all that behind them. But you can see why they've been provoked into doing this. Nobody will talk to them. Nobody seems to be prepared to take them seriously. There's no sense of a political dialogue. None of this was necessary. It could all have been solved a couple of months ago by setting up a commission of inquiry into the reasons for the demonstrations, the way they were being policed, and the way the demonstrators were behaving.
Let me ask you this. I mean, you fought in those last few years when you were governor. You fought for democracy here, and to an extent you won. I mean, but is there a sense in which you also raised expectations maybe here which were unrealistic?
No, I don't think there is, because China, before 1997, was saying that the way the Legislative Council was organised would be a matter for Hong Kong after 1997. It was part of the Hong Kong autonomy which was promised. It's China which has rowed back on those things. But frankly, that wasn't what this was all about to begin with. This was all about the extradition treaty. It was all about the growing sense that China was squeezing Hong Kong and gradually, step by step, was trying to undermine the freedoms which are part of Hong Kong's sense of citizenship. That's what all this is about. And it's not going to be stopped, as I said, by an attitude to public order policing, which has brought protests from every human rights group I can think of.
Do you fear for the future here, the immediate future here?
I fear for the future unless Carrie Lam actually intervenes and understands the importance of dialogue, understands the importance of talking to people, and understands the importance of giving them the opportunity of reviewing through an independent commission of inquiry how we got to this situation. It's before long, unless we're very, very lucky, people are going to get killed, people are going to get shot. The idea that with public order policing, you send police officers out with live bullets, with live ammunition, is preposterous.
Lord Patton. Well, I lived in Hong Kong for years and have been back many times, but never have I seen it so divided. The protesters, mainly students, determined to protect their freedoms. Many others in Hong Kong worried about the impact on business, on tourism, and the future. They are resigned to a future under Chinese control.
There are few places of peace in Hong Kong right now, but this is one of them. A temple amid the tumult. A Buddhist shrine that is all about tranquility and harmony, qualities of late in short supply here.
5 demand! No one less! 5 demand! No one less!
Protest is what this place is about now, and protest that once had a target, an unpopular extradition bill, is now dangerously for China about democracy, human rights, and fear for the future.
What are you protesting about?
We are protesting because the government is become more totalitarianism. So that's why we are coming out to fight against this system.
So it's about democracy, full democracy.
It's
autonomy and also the democracy.
But this is not promised in the agreement with China, is it?
It should be. It should be.
Of course, we know we never got democracy from China, but we still need to fight because it is Hong Kong, it's not China yet. So,
I think no one will know. No one will know how the way we will win or how's the ending. Maybe we will lose, maybe we will win, but we have to fight until we know the answer.
But of course, Hong Kong is also about making money. And in Koxing Street, Chinese medicine is traditionally big business.
A kilogram of fish stomach is about $7,000 US.
US dollar.
And 40.
Yeah.
That's crazy. But
that's the more expensive one.
But the violence is killing the trade here and dividing the generations.
It's something that has to happen, in order for change. So, some people don't agree with the violence, but I think that this is a way for the people to express how they feel about the situation, which in my opinion, I feel like is very hopeless.
Stephanie Chan supports the protests, but as we speak, her mother sits under a picture of the Chinese President Xi Jinping and watches Carrie Lam addressing the people of Hong Kong. She thinks the violence threatens her business.
Everyone is worried about, the business and also about the violence, whether it's going to affect them personally. They think that, Hong Kong is definitely belong to China, and also that, we should follow everything that, they're imposing on us.
This family say their business has been quiet for months and blame the government as well as the protesters. And this shop owner fears the violence could severely damage Hong Kong. In the long run, he says, we will all suffer because people who do business will leave. Traditions die hard here, but the cohesion of this former colony returned to communist China is under strain like seldom before.
Well, as you saw there, Carrie Lam went on TV to say this. She would not allow what she called extreme violence to destroy Hong Kong. But the vast majority of the protesters are peaceful and they keep coming out in their thousands. They did it again today and they say they will carry on. The big question is, where will all this end? From Hong Kong, good evening.